Honolulu, Hawaii, a paradise in every sense of the word, where turquoise waves kissed golden sands and palm trees swayed in the soft island breeze. Tourists came from all over to escape the chaos of city life, to lose themselves in the slow rhythm of the ocean. But beneath the beauty, beneath the postcard perfect scenery, darkness lurked where no one expected it. For 19-year-old Nancy Anderson, Honolulu wasn't just a vacation destination, it was the start of her new life. Fresh out of high school, she had chosen to leave her small town roots behind in Bay City, Michigan, eager to experience the world on her own terms. She moved to Hawaii with dreams of independence, of standing on her own feet for the first time. Everything seemed to be falling into place. She found a job at McDonald's, sharing a cozy apartment with a roommate. The ocean was just a short walk away, the salty breeze a constant reminder of her new adventure. The city was alive with music, laughter, and endless possibilities. But paradise can be deceptive. And for Nancy, the dream was about to take a horrifying turn. On January 7th, 1972, her life ended in an unspeakable act of violence, one so brutal that it left detectives grasping at shadows for over 5 decades. The crime scene was something out of a nightmare, and what made it worse, there was no obvious reason why. No robbery, no forced entry, no enemies. Nancy Anderson was a 19-year-old girl living a quiet life, working an ordinary job. So why had she been targeted? And why did her killer make sure she never had a chance to survive? For years, there were no answers, no justice, just silence. Until the truth emerged from the most unlikely place, a strand of DNA buried in the past for 50 years, waiting to be uncovered. To understand the horror of what happened, we first have to understand who Nancy was. She was the second youngest of 4 siblings raised in a close-knit, hardworking family in Bay City, Michigan. Her parents described her as a quiet, responsible girl, someone who wasn't reckless or rebellious, but had a natural curiosity for the world beyond her hometown. Nancy had graduated from T.L. Handy High School the previous year. She wasn't quite sure what she wanted to do with her future yet, but she knew she wanted something different. Hawaii had seemed like the perfect opportunity and adventure before deciding on college or career plans. Moving to Honolulu was a bold step, especially for someone as soft-spoken as Nancy, but she had embraced it. She was settling in well, making friends at work, enjoying the warm island air. Her days were simple. She worked morning shifts at McDonald's in Waikiki, often walking home in the early afternoon. She and her roommate, a fellow Midwesterner, had a routine work, grocery runs, the occasional beach trip. Life was steady, predictable, safe. There was nothing to suggest she had enemies, nothing to suggest she was in danger. And yet, just 3 months after moving to Honolulu, she was dead. Why? What had happened inside that small apartment on January 7th, 1972? Had she let her killer in? Had she been followed home? Or was she targeted by someone she never even realized was watching? The answers wouldn't come for 5 decades. But when they did, they would reveal a name that no one had ever suspected. It was a quiet afternoon in Honolulu, the kind of day where the air smelled of salt water and distant hibiscus blooms. The hum of traffic, the chatter of tourists, the crash of waves, it was just another day in paradise. But inside apartment 405, something was very, very wrong. At 2:30 p.m., Nancy's roommate arrived home. She had been out running errands, enjoying the simplicity of their island routine. As she climbed the stairs to their apartment, nothing seemed out of place. No strange noises, no signs of trouble. Then she reached the front door. It was unlocked. That was unusual, but not enough to raise immediate alarm. Maybe Nancy had just forgotten. Maybe she had stepped out for a moment and left it ajar. Still, As she pushed open the door, a strange feeling crept over her. The apartment was quiet, too quiet. "Nancy," she called out, her voice echoing slightly in the small space. No answer. She stepped inside. The living room was untouched. The kitchen, the hallway, nothing seemed disturbed, but something felt off. Then she reached Nancy's bedroom door. She turned the handle, pushed it open, and her world collapsed. A scream tore through the apartment, shattering the afternoon silence. Blood everywhere. The walls, the floor, the bed. It was a massacre. A scene so brutal, so unthinkable, that her roommate could hardly process what she was seeing. Nancy lay motionless on the floor. Her body was riddled with stab wounds, 63 in total. The sheer violence of the attack was staggering. This wasn't just a murder. This was rage. This was overkill. Nancy had been attacked with such force that it was clear whoever did this had wanted her dead beyond any doubt. Her roommate stumbled backward, her breath coming in short gasps. She ran for the phone, shaking as she dialed for help. The police arrived within minutes, but what they found only deepened the mystery. Despite the carnage, there was no sign of forced entry. The door hadn't been broken or tampered with. There were no shattered windows. Whoever had done this had either been invited in or had a way inside without anyone noticing. And then came the most chilling realization of all. Nothing was stolen. Nancy hadn't been killed in a robbery gone wrong. This wasn't about money or valuables. This was personal. But why? And more importantly, who? The sheer brutality of Nancy's murder sent shockwaves through Honolulu. A young woman slaughtered in her own home with no clear reason why. The police needed answers, and they needed them fast. Investigators turned to the most logical suspects first. There was talk of an ex-boyfriend back in Michigan. Had there been bad blood? Did he follow her to Hawaii? A few phone calls ruled that out. He had never left the mainland. Then there was a maintenance worker who had access to the building. Maybe he had seen Nancy, fixated on her. Maybe she had turned him down. But he had an airtight alibi. And then a chilling coincidence. A knife salesman had been seen going door to door in Nancy's apartment complex on the very day she was murdered. Detectives tracked him down. He admitted it immediately. Yes, he had knocked on Nancy's door. Yes, they had spoken. For a moment, it seemed like they had their man. A knife salesman, a woman stabbed 63 times. The connection was too eerie to ignore. But something didn't fit. Nancy had no defensive wounds, no sign of a struggle. Had the salesman really convinced her to let him inside, then suddenly snapped? His alibi was rock solid. Security footage placed him across town at the estimated time of death. And just like that, another lead vanished. One by one, the names were crossed off the suspect list, and just like that, the case began to slip away. The weeks after Nancy's murder were chaotic, detectives chasing leads, the press reporting every grim detail, the city gripped by fear. But as the months dragged on, the noise quieted. No new witnesses, no new leads, no fresh evidence. And then the worst thing that can happen to a murder case happened. Nancy's name started to fade from the headlines. Honolulu was a bustling city, and the world moved forward. The case went cold. For years, detectives would occasionally reopen the file, hoping for new technology, a fresh tip, anything. But each time, the case remained stuck in time. Nancy's family never gave up. Her brother, her parents, they refused to let her name be forgotten. But by the time the 2010s rolled around, most people in Hawaii had never even heard of Nancy Anderson. And then, one day, A phone call changed everything. For nearly 5 decades, Nancy's family lived with the unbearable weight of the unknown. No answers, no justice, just an open wound that time refused to heal. But in 2019, Nancy's brother made a decision that would change everything. He wasn't ready to let the case fade away. He had heard about a new kind of forensic science, one that had solved the Golden State Killer case and dozens of others long thought impossible to crack. He reached out to Cease Moore, a forensic genealogist who had built a reputation for solving the unsolvable. Her expertise wasn't in fingerprints or old case files. It was in genetic genealogy, a revolutionary method that could use DNA to trace a killer's identity through family trees and ancestry databases. If a murderer had left behind even the smallest trace of DNA, Moore's team could find their bloodline, their relatives, and eventually them. It was a long shot, but it was the last shot Nancy's family had left. Nancy's case had been considered impossible to solve, too old, too cold, but science had caught up with time. When forensic teams revisited the original crime scene evidence, they discovered a crucial piece of DNA that had been overlooked for years. A trace of the killer so small it had been nearly invisible. Moore's team got to work. They didn't just test the sample against criminal databases because the killer had never been arrested. Instead, they reverse engineered a family tree. They uploaded the DNA profile to genealogy sites, the same ones everyday people use to find lost relatives. And the results led them to a name no one expected. Someone who had never been a suspect. Someone who had lived in Nancy's apartments complex in 1972. A man who had gone on to live a very different life. Tudor Kyrilla. The DNA trail had done what half a century of police work could not. It led to Tudor Kyrilla. At the time of Nancy Anderson's murder, Kyrilla was a 27-year-old graduate student living in the very same Honolulu apartment complex as Nancy. And yet, for nearly 50 years, no one had ever looked at him. He had never been questioned, never been suspected. His name had never appeared in police reports. So how had a man who lived just steps away from Nancy's murder scene gone unnoticed for so long? And more importantly, what else had he been hiding? By the time investigators uncovered his name, Tudor Kyrilla was no longer a graduate student in Honolulu. He had become something else entirely. After leaving Hawaii, Kyrilla reinvented himself. He moved to Nevada and built a life of power and influence. He became a lawyer, then a prominent political figure, even serving as the acting Attorney General of Nevada for a brief period. To the outside world, he was a successful, intelligent, respected man, a man who had seemingly left his past behind. But had he? Because buried beneath decades of legal briefs and political maneuvering was a chilling question. Had he spent his entire life hiding a monstrous secret? After 50 years of silence, the past had finally caught up with Tudor Kyrilla. It was 2021 and detectives had tracked him down to Reno, Nevada. He was no longer a young graduate student, he was an elderly man in his late 70s, living out his final years in quiet obscurity. But when he opened his door to find detectives standing there, his past was no longer a secret. They had one simple request: the DNA sample. If he was innocent, a quick test would clear his name. But Kyrilla refused. He knew exactly what they were looking for, and he knew exactly what they would find. However, detectives didn't need his cooperation. Instead, they used a different approach. They tracked down Kyrilla's son and obtained a DNA sample from him. Because DNA doesn't lie, and when the results came back, the truth was undeniable. The DNA match was perfect. Forensics confirmed it. The blood found at Nancy Anderson's murder scene in 1972 belonged to Tudor Kyrilla. After 5 decades of mystery, the case had finally been solved. Nancy's killer had been unmasked. But before detectives could place him in handcuffs, something happened that no one saw coming. Just 2 days before police could formally arrest him, Tudor Kyrilla attempted to take his own life. Tudor Kyrilla must have known his time was up. For decades, he had managed to live in the shadows, his secret buried beneath a life of power and success. But DNA doesn't forget, and now it had caught up with him. Just 2 days before detectives could officially place him under arrest, Kyrilla made a desperate move. Alone in his Reno home, he attempted to take his own life. Did he think he could escape justice even in death? But fate had other plans. He survived. Paramedics rushed him to the hospital, stabilizing him before it was too late. And when he woke up, groggy and weak, police were waiting. This time, there was no more running. In September 2022, at 77 years old, Tudor Kyrilla was formally arrested for the murder of Nancy Anderson. The case that had haunted Honolulu for 50 years had finally been cracked. Nancy's family finally had a name, a face. But was it really over? Because there was one final, chilling truth about this case that no one could ignore. Kyrilla had lived his life as a free man for 5 decades. And if he had gotten away with murder once, could Nancy Anderson have been his only victim? For 50 years, Nancy Anderson's family had lived with nothing but questions. Now they finally had a name, Tudor Kyrilla, a man who had hidden in plain sight, a man whose DNA had betrayed his darkest secret. But that wasn't enough. Nancy's family wanted more than just a name, they wanted answers. Why Nancy? Was she chosen at random, or had she unknowingly crossed paths with her killer before that fateful day? Was there a connection no one had ever seen? Had Kyrilla been watching her? Did he know her routine? What really happened in apartment 405? For investigators, one thing was obvious: Kyrilla's attack had been personal. This wasn't a quick, calculated killing. It was frenzied, rage-fueled, deliberate overkill, 63 stab wounds in what could only be described as a brutal slaughter. But why? Had he fixated on Nancy? Had she rejected his advances? Had she simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time? Only one person knew the answers to those questions. And Tudor Kyrilla refused to speak. Even after his arrest, he remained silent. No confession, no explanations, just a man who had gotten away with murder for 50 years and seemed determined to take his secrets to the grave. Still, Nancy's family held onto hope. A trial meant evidence. A trial meant closure. A trial meant he would be forced to answer for what he had done. But just when it seemed like justice would finally be served, everything changed again. Tudor Kyrilla would never stand trial. In December 2023, while awaiting his day in court, he died in custody. It was over. There would be no trial, no testimony, no moment of reckoning. No chance for Nancy's family to face him in court and demand the truth. Just an empty resolution. The case was solved, but justice had slipped away yet again. Nancy's family had spent half a century waiting for answers, and now those answers were buried forever with the man who had taken her life. There would be no apology, no motive, no confession. Just a dead killer and the chilling knowledge that he had lived freely for decades, while Nancy had never been given the chance to grow up, to build a future, to live the life she should have had. Her killer had stolen everything from her. And in the end, he stole justice from her family too. But the real question remained, had he gotten away with more than just one murder? For 50 years, Nancy Anderson's murder remained a mystery. Not because the evidence wasn't there, but because the technology to understand it simply didn't exist yet. What finally solved this case wasn't an eyewitness, a confession, or a lucky break. It was DNA. And more importantly, it was the work of a new kind of investigator, Cease Moore. Moore wasn't a detective. She didn't carry a badge or interrogate suspects. But in the modern world of crime solving, she was just as powerful as any investigator with a gun and a badge. She wasn't looking for fingerprints, she was looking for something far more incriminating: blood, DNA, a genetic fingerprint that no suspect could ever erase. And that's exactly how Tudor Carilla was caught. Forensic genealogy had turned a 50-year-old cold case into a modern-day manhunt. Nancy's killer thought he had buried his secret forever. But in the end, science brought it back to the surface. Moore's work proved something terrifying. Even after half a century, forensic science can still expose the truth. And that raises an even bigger question. If one cold case can be solved this way, how many more killers are still out there thinking they got away with murder? Tudor Kyrilla's guilt was undeniable. The DNA left at the crime scene told the story his silence never would. But even with his name finally exposed, something about this case still doesn't sit right, because the details don't all add up. Take the autopsy report. One strange detail stood out to investigators. Nancy had been stabbed with 2 different knives, 2 weapons, 1 crime scene. Did that mean 2 people were involved? Could there have been an accomplice, someone else, in the apartment that day? Or had Kyrilla acted alone, switching weapons mid-murder for reasons we may never understand? Even after 50 years of investigation, the truth about what really happened inside apartment 405 remains murky. Was Kyrilla the sole monster in this story? Or is there someone else out there who knows the full truth? There's one more detail about the case that makes it even more chilling. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken locks, no struggle at the door, which means Nancy either let her killer in willingly or he already had a way inside. But why? Nancy wasn't reckless. She wasn't the type to trust a stranger. So had she met Tudor Kyrilla before? Had he been watching her, following her, waiting for the right moment? Or was she simply in the wrong place at the wrong time? The most haunting possibility of all. Maybe Kyrilla had been hunting her long before that day. Now we finally know who killed Nancy Anderson. But the biggest question remains, why? Did Tudor Kyrilla have other victims? Could he have killed before or even after Nancy? And most chilling of all, was there more to this crime than we ever realized? There's one thing we do know. Time couldn't erase what Tudor Kyrilla did. Nancy Anderson's story refused to be forgotten, and in the end, the truth came back to haunt him.